Three things ruin a man: power, money, and women. I never wanted any power. I never had any money. And the only woman in my life is up at the house right now. That was a quote, not from me, Mr. Beat, but from a dude who was never supposed to be president. But he was. A dude who never even sought out leadership, but today is highly regarded as one of the greatest leaders in American history. A dude who failed at multiple business ventures and even went bankrupt. A dude who, after he was president, moved back into the same house he lived in back when he went bankrupt and then went into debt again, partially because his income at the time was only $112.56 a month, which is about $1,300 a month in today's money. A dude who totally did not want the job. A dude who few had even heard of before he was 50 years old. Here is the story of Harry Truman, the most average person to ever become president.
I used to have a sign on my desk that said, "The buck stops here." The buck stops at the president's desk when he's president of the United States, and he either makes the decisions or he lets them go by default, and you can't afford to do that when you're president.
Ah, there it is. Here is where our story begins. Harry S. Truman was born in a bedroom too small for a bed in this tiny house that had no running water in Lamar, Missouri on May 8th, 1884. Harry's middle name, S, was not an abbreviation of any specific name. It was meant to honor both his grandpas. His mom, Martha, who friends called Maddie, grew up hating Jayhawkers, or anti-slavery crusaders who lived in Kansas during the Bleeding Kansas era. Why did she hate them? Well, Jayhawkers destroyed her family's farm in 1861, for starters. Union troops also treated her family badly during the American Civil War. Because of this, for the rest of her life, she'd be quite nostalgic for the Confederacy. Anyway, Harry's dad, John Truman, was a farmer and later livestock trader, an extremely hard worker, though he rarely made that much money. Harry only lived in this here house until he was 10 months old. At that age, his family moved to a farm near Harrisonville, then to Belton, and finally to this farm. But when he was 6,
he moved to here.
Independence, Missouri, just outside of Kansas City, and he lived here most of his life. In fact, today, it's where his presidential library and museum is, which is behind me right now. I've been in here many times. I've forced many students to come here on field trips. Harry had 2 younger siblings, John Vivian and Mary Jane. As a child, Harry loved music and history. Heck yeah, he also loved learning and got good grades in all the schools he attended. In fact, he did so well that he skipped 3rd grade. He loved reading, but the words were all blurry when he tried to read newspapers, so Maddie got him glasses that helped him see those words much better, beginning when he was around 7 years old, and for the rest of his life, he had to wear thick glasses. Back then, a young boy wearing glasses was not very common, and Harry's doctor ordered him not to play sports so he wouldn't break them. But he broke other stuff. One time, he accidentally slammed a cellar door on his foot, which cut off the end of his big toe. Maddie held the cut off piece of toe in place until a doctor came to wrap it up and put medicine on it. Incredibly, the toe stayed in place and completely healed. Behind me is the house that Truman lived in as a teenager, although it looks a lot different today than it did back then. Truman's dad lost the house in 1902 after some poor business investments. By that time, Harry was becoming quite good at the piano. That's probably because he'd get up at 5 in the morning and practice 2 hours every day. Dang. In high school, Harry got along better with females than males, even though he was still apparently awkward around females. Yeah, I can relate to that. One girl he particularly liked was a girl named Bess Wallace. He would volunteer to carry her books for her and offer to help her study, but she didn't really like him. Meanwhile, Harry worked. He'd earn money by doing odd jobs for his Jewish neighbors who couldn't do certain work on the Sabbath. He also worked at a drugstore for a while. In 1900, Harry was a page for the Democratic Party National Convention in Kansas City. His dad had been a proud and active Democrat for Harry's entire life, and Harry would be a pretty big fan of the party as well. Harry graduated from Independence High School in 1901 when he was just just 17 years old. One big dream he had was to attend West Point, aka the United States Military Academy. However, they rejected his application, apparently due to his poor eyesight.
Shortly after Truman graduated high school, his father had a significant financial reversal, which meant that Truman engaged in a series of jobs that I think a lot of people can relate to. The idea of trying things, surviving.
Even though his family couldn't afford college tuition, Truman did briefly attend Spalding's Commercial College, a business school in Kansas City. He had to drop out of college after only a semester to earn money to help support his family, though. Truman briefly worked in the mailroom of the Kansas City Star, but soon used his business school experience to get a job as a timekeeper for the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway. Later, his brother Vivian and he worked together as clerks at the National Bank of Commerce in Kansas City. Harry got $100 a month, or $3,470 a month in today's money. Not too shabby for a 22-year-old. He hadn't given up his dream of joining the military, though. Around that time, he joined the Missouri National Guard, eventually earning the rank of corporal. Wait, how'd he get in? I thought his eyesight was too bad. Well, it was. He only passed the eye exam by memorizing an eye chart. Before we continue on with Harry Truman's life, it's time to continue on with our lives. You see, we live in the information age, a time when information is constantly bombarding us, and much of that information is confusing and misleading. That's why I'm once again excited to be sponsored by Ground News. Ground News is a website, an app, that lets you compare how events in the news are being covered so you can become a smarter news consumer and reduce polarization by finding common ground with people who think differently. Go to ground.news/Mr. Beats or just simply scan the QR code on the screen. There's a QR code on the screen right now? Oh, there it is. Yes, that's the QR code to scan. Anyway, let me show you how it works. See? Look at all that gravy, baby. Ground News shows you how the same story is being covered across the political spectrum and around the world. Oh, look, here's a story about climate change. Look at that bias distribution. There's hardly any sources on the right covering it. What a surprise. With every story, you can also see the total number of articles published on it, who owns each publication, and the factuality of the source. You can compare the headlines and click to read each from the original source. I particularly enjoy its My News Bias feature, a personal dashboard where you can get insights into your reading habits to see where you're getting your news from and see if you have blind spots. Basically, Ground News is my one-stop shop for news because you can see all the biases in one place. So try Ground News to become a smarter news consumer. Subscribe through my link, ground.news/Mr. Beat, and save 40% off unlimited access this month. Okay. Back to Harry Truman.
It's interesting because Truman is one of the least likely people you would identify. If you'd known him as a teenager, if you'd known him in his 20s, you wouldn't say, oh, here's a guy who's going to become the President of the United States.
In 1906, Truman's parents talked him into moving to his grandparents' farm that he had spent much of his childhood at to help run it. And that farm, or what's left of it, I should say, is now behind me. The National Park Service now owns it, and it's rarely open. Truman lived here between 1906 and 1917. Yeah, it's windy out here. Whoa! When Truman lived here, it had no plumbing or electricity. It also had no privacy. Truman shared the house with his grandma, parents, sister, and brother, and occasionally random people the family hired. It was a serene place, though, far from the bustling Kansas City. Truman worked his butt off at this farm and never had much to show for it. In the spring and summer, he often put in a full day of back-breaking labor, whether it was planting corn, feeding the cows, or stacking hay. Truman spent the best years of his life on this farm.
He hated being a farmer, but it's the longest job he ever had. But although he hated it, when he was campaigning, when he went to the farm communities, he understood what their grievances were.
Working here gave Truman a lot of time to think. Like, He still thought about this girl he really liked back in high school. You remember. Bess Wallace. In 1910, he began running into her again and totally started flirting. Eventually, even though Bess's mother did not approve of Harry, the two started dating. However, after Truman proposed to her in 1911, she turned him down. Harry thought it was because he didn't make enough money. Heck, he didn't own anything, for crying out loud. Truman was one of the few presidents to never own his own home prior to being president. Because he soon realized the farm wasn't gonna make him rich, Truman began seeking out business ventures around the country. He tried to invest in various things, from real estate to oil to mining, but he rarely made that much money from them. Hey, at least it gave him an excuse to get out of Missouri. As it turns out, Bess didn't care about Harry not having much money. In November 1913, she told him, quote, if she married anyone, it would be him. After Harry's dad died in 1914, the pressure was then on Harry to make the entire family money. However, literally on the same day the United States entered World War I, Truman rejoined the military to fight. While training at Fort Sill in Oklahoma, Truman met James Pendergast, the nephew of the infamous Tom Pendergast, a political boss who heavily controlled Kansas City politics. He and James became friends. Little did Truman know that this friendship would eventually lead him to becoming the President of the United States. Anyway, Truman and James got deployed to France. There he is, in uniform. Just look at those pants, man. Anyway, Truman did so well fighting that he got promoted to captain. The war dramatically changed Truman. It was also the first time people saw his true leadership capabilities.
He's the only president to serve in combat in World War I, and I think that really set him apart as we get to World War II, because he'd been on the ground and he had, led men, been in combat, and been thrown off his horse. I mean, if the technology changes between World War I and World War II. He's riding a horse in World War I. I think that experience really set him apart.
The Battery D was known for being a rowdy bunch that drank too much alcohol. Folks even nicknamed them, quote, the Dizzy D. Well, Truman straightened them out. By the end of the war, they were a disciplined bunch who greatly respected his leadership. After a surprise attack by the Germans at night, his soldiers began to flee. However, Truman started cussing them out in order to get them to find the courage to stay and fight. His men were not used to hearing Truman cuss, which is apparently why they stayed and fought. The Dizzy D saw lots of action during the war, firing more than 10,000 rounds on German forces.
But the other part of it too that people often forget, it gave him a series of political supporters. Those veterans stood by him. Even when we see the photographs of the 1949 inauguration, after the 48 election, there's a large portion of Battery D that marches in that inaugural parade.
After the war ended, Truman returned home here to the farm, but he knew that being a farmer the rest of his life wasn't going to earn him much money. He almost immediately began looking at starting his own business. Meanwhile, Bess was finally ready to settle down. She and Harry got married on June 28, 1919. They moved in with Bess's family in this house in Independence. Today, this house, and two of the nearby houses where other relatives of the Trumans lived, make up what's known as the Harry S. Truman National Historic Site. Around the time of the wedding, Truman started a clothing store with his good friend, Edward Jacobson. Jacobson had served in the war with Truman. Behind me is where Truman's store was here in downtown Kansas City. Truman had bad timing opening the store up. It went bankrupt during the Depression of 1920 to 1921. But that's okay, because an old friend of Harry's showed up to the store one day with a proposition. That old friend was James Pendergast. He had brought his dad, Mike Pendergast, brother of the aforementioned Tom Pendergast. They asked Truman if he'd like to run to be a judge as a Democrat for Jackson County's Eastern District. Truman had no experience in law or politics whatsoever, but he agreed. Now, despite not having any experience in law or politics, Truman got elected judge, mostly thanks to the Pendergast political machine. To his surprise, he loved being a judge. Plus, it paid decent, $64,000 a year in today's money. However, he wouldn't be re-elected. After Truman lost re-election, he sold memberships to the nearby Kansas City Automobile Club and was like, this sucks. His income was inconsistent as a salesman, plus he still had debts to pay off from his failed clothing store. Oh, and now he had to take care of another human being. Truman's only daughter, Mary Margaret, was born in this very house on February 17th, 1924. Truman was a good dad to Margaret, and the two had a close relationship for the rest of his life. In 1926, Truman went back to the Pendergasts to persuade them to help him run for presiding judge of Jackson County. They didn't need much persuasion, and Truman easily got elected later that year as Jackson County Judge. Truman coordinated a bunch of new public works projects that dramatically modernized the Kansas City Metro. Even though Truman was associated with the often corrupt Tom Pendergast, he did gain a reputation as one of the few folks in local politics with integrity. Truman easily won re-election in 1930. By 1934, Truman was considering running for either governor or perhaps the United States House of Representatives. He was surprised to find out that the Pendergast actually wanted him to run for the United States Senate. Whoa-ness! That said, Truman was Tom Pendergast's fifth choice to run for U.S. Senate. The first four people Pendergast asked backed out. But still, it was an honor for Truman to be asked. And of course, Truman won, not just because he was well-liked as a judge, and not just because he heavily campaigned across Missouri, but because of the Pendergast machine, of course, which, probably heavily rigged the election in Truman's favor. Oh, they stuffed some ballot boxes, all right. At the age of 50, few outside of Kansas City knew who the heck Harry Truman was. In Washington, D.C., he was simply just known as, quote, the senator from Pendergast. But, contrary to popular belief at the time, Pendergast didn't really have that much control over Truman. In many ways, Harry Truman going to Washington was like Mr. Smith going to Washington. Even though that movie, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, came out 4 years after Truman first arrived in Washington as senator, we finally get a clearer picture of Truman's political views. Sure, he almost universally supported President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal programs, but he also talked trash about corporate greed and Wall Street speculators having way too much power. Truman played a big role getting the Civil Aeronautics Act of 1938 and Transportation Act of 1940 passed. Still, many historians say his first term as senator was mostly not that significant. Indeed, Truman was kind of out of place in the Senate. In fact, he was so meh that other Democrats challenged him in the primary as he sought re-election in 1940. Truman barely survived the challenge and only narrowly got re-elected in the general election. By then, the United States was quickly getting involved in World War II, and Truman had strong opinions about it, criticizing both Nazi Germany and the Communist Soviet Union.
Not that President Roosevelt cared much about his opinion.
The one thing that finally got President Roosevelt's attention, however, was Truman being chairman of the Senate Special Committee to investigate the National Defense Program. The committee called for investigations into all the waste and war profiteering Truman saw while visiting various military bases. Basically, the military was wasting money, and Truman's committee, actually it eventually just became known as the, quote, Truman Committee, demanded it be held more accountable. Truman's committee ultimately saved the federal government hundreds of billions of dollars in today's money as Roosevelt ran for re-election a fourth time in 1944. Some worried he may not survive a full fourth term, which meant that whoever his vice president was would be the next president. Currently, that was Henry Wallace, but many thought Wallace leaned too far to the left of Roosevelt. Therefore, the Democratic Party sought a more, quote, moderate running mate for FDR. To Truman's surprise, that moderate running mate ended up being, Harry S. Truman.
Everybody knew Roosevelt was sick, and they knew that they were in fact picking the next president. Truman was they called him the Missouri Compromise. He was a compromise candidate. He didn't necessarily want to be the vice president. He loved the Senate. He didn't want to leave. He also had read enough history to know history has not been kind to those who came in through the back door. He didn't want to ascend to the presidency through the demise of the president, and he knew that would be a likelihood. Now, nobody had any idea it'd be 82 days.
Despite some more right-leaning Democrats worried that Truman was too sympathetic to African-American rights, it was another landslide victory for FDR. Shortly after becoming vice president, Truman made a bunch of people mad by attending Tom Pendergast's funeral. After the media talked trash about it, Truman was like, dude, he was my friend. Still, though, his time as Veep was pretty uneventful, despite the country leading the Allies in the biggest freaking war of all time. President Roosevelt and Vice President Truman only met in person twice. You heard that right. Twice.
FDR goes to Yalta in February of 1945. Truman's vice president at that point. They just had the inauguration the previous month. Truman stays home. So that tells you a lot about how connected he was in that inner circle. He was not in it.
Truman had only been Veep for 82 days when President Roosevelt died on April 12th, 1945. That day, Truman was in the Capitol and rushed over to the White House where he met up with Eleanor Roosevelt, Franklin's wife. He asked her if there was anything he could do for her. She reportedly replied, quote, "Is there anything we can do for you? For you are the one in trouble now." At 7:09 p.m. local time in the West Wing of the White House, Chief Justice Harlan Stone swore Truman in as the 33rd President of the United States. Less than a year prior, few Americans knew who Harry Truman was. Now he was the so-called leader of the free world. Truman was president during arguably the most consequential time in modern human history.
He inherits such a complicated situation. You know, he comes in April 12th. The war's still going on in Europe. War's still going on in Asia. And if you look at the timeline in our museum, it's incredible. I would argue there's no other president that had so much to deal with in those first 4 or 5 months. He faces all of these challenges, and he does it anyway with very little preparation, has to make a series of decisions. It's kind of incredible that he has so much to deal with.
Truman demonstrated remarkable decisiveness early on. He initially kept Roosevelt's cabinet, but by the end of 1946, only one Roosevelt appointee was left. Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal. His main advisors came from the State Department. Check out all the stuff that happened just in a few months span in 1945, right after Truman became president. It's crazy. The first thing Truman had to deal with? Oh, no big deal. Just freaking ending World War II, that's all. Within days after taking over the presidency, Truman learned the full details of the Manhattan Project, the code name for the American-led effort to secretly develop an atomic weapon. That's right, the Manhattan Project was so secret that Roosevelt had not even told Truman about it before he died. Within weeks after Truman taking over the presidency, Germany surrendered. 3 months after taking over the presidency, Truman flew to Germany for the Potsdam Conference. There, he met with Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, and Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, to figure out how to handle the end of World War II in Europe. They decided to divide Germany into 4 occupation zones, and Berlin, the capital of Germany, also into 4 occupation zones, a Soviet Soviet sector, British sector, French sector, and American sector, of course. Interestingly, the Berlin occupation zones were completely surrounded by the Soviet sector. More on that in a bit. Anyway, while at the Potsdam Conference, Truman learned that the first dropping of the atomic bomb had been successful. He vaguely hinted to Stalin that the United States had developed a new, much more destructive type of weapon to potentially use against Japan. Oh yeah, Japan was still fighting the Allies and refusing to surrender. While Stalin also told Truman that the Soviet Union would launch an invasion of the Japanese-held Manchuria in China, this still left Truman with a huge decision. Should he or shouldn't he authorize the dropping of an atomic bomb on Japan? He carefully considered the question for the next few days. After consulting many folks for advice, supporters of dropping an atomic bomb argued that it would save not only hundreds of thousands of American lives, but also hundreds of thousands of Japanese lives. Opponents of dropping an atomic bomb argued it would be a war crime that was militarily not necessary. Japan was likely to surrender anyway. Regardless, Truman made arguably the most difficult decision an American president has ever had to make. He decided to go ahead and drop an atomic bomb on Japan. He ordered it dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. 3 days later, after Japan had apparently shown no signs of wanting to surrender, Truman ordered a second atomic bomb to be dropped on Nagasaki. Both bombs ultimately killed as many as 226,000 people, and most killed were actually civilians. To this day, Harry Truman is the only human being in history to order nuclear weapons dropped on people. Historians continue to debate whether or not it was the right decision to make. It's worth saying that Truman never doubted it and defended the decision for the rest of his life. And it worked. I mean, it worked in terms of getting Japan to stop fighting anyway. 6 days after the bombing of Nagasaki, Japan surrendered to the Allies. Just over 4 months after becoming president, Truman arguably had more influence than anybody else in ending the most devastating war in history. Now that the war was over, Truman then faced the momentous task of rebuilding Europe and Japan. What ultimately resulted was what's today known as the Marshall Plan, the biggest foreign aid program in history. Truman signed it into law on April 3rd, 1948. The Marshall Plan not only provided the equivalent of hundreds of billions of dollars of aid to war-torn countries, it also removed trade barriers and helped modernize industries in those war-torn countries. The Truman administration established strong relations with Germany and Japan, and both have been strong allies of the United States ever since. After World War II, only two global superpowers remained, the United States and the Soviet Union. As far back as the Potsdam Conference, Truman learned that it was going to be difficult to trust Joseph Stalin. Due to this, he soon found himself doing whatever he could to stop the spread of the influence of the Soviet Union. That's right, folks. His presidency marked the beginning of what we today call the Cold War, or the time when the Soviet Union and the United States were big enemies but never officially went to war with each other. After intervening against Soviet influence in both Turkey and Greece at the end of World War II, Truman did put that aside for a while to work with the Soviet Union in the formation of the United Nations, a diplomatic and political international organization there for the purposes of, world peace. The United Nations is still going strong today, by the way. Other than that, though, Truman adopted what became known as a policy of, quote, containment. It basically assumed that the Soviet Union would always be trying to expand its influence, and so the United States and other, quote, democratic countries had to do whatever they could to contain this influence. In other words, democracy good, communism bad, stop communism, and spread democracy whenever possible. This containment policy became more formalized after Truman made a surprise appearance before a joint session of Congress on March 12, 1947. In an 18-minute speech, Truman called for the United States to do more to, quote, support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. He also called for a foreign policy of aiding democracies around the world, quote, against authoritarian threats.
If we falter in our leadership, we may endanger the peace of the world.
Truman's broad international agenda became known simply as the Truman Doctrine, and it has dramatically shaped and influenced American foreign policy ever since. In July 1947, Truman signed the National Security Act, which created the U.S. Air Force, the modern Department of Defense, the National Security Council, and the Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA. Oh no. Is that the deep state you created, Truman? Little did he know.
Did you say little did he know?
Yes.
I've written papers on little did he know. I used to teach a class based on little did he know. I mean, I once gave an entire seminar on little did he know.
But perhaps Truman was doing too much because in early 1948, Truman was a very unpopular president. His approval rating was just barely over 36%. 1948, another pivotal year in American history. In fact, I often call it one of the craziest years in American history. First of all, despite angering the majority of Middle Eastern countries and many within his own administration, Truman officially recognized the state of Israel on the day it became a country, May 14th, 1948. The United States has had a pretty solid relationship with the country ever since. Second, tensions got crazy between the Soviet Union and the United States after what became known as the Berlin Airlift. Joseph Stalin, the aforementioned dictator of the Soviet Union, started a blockade to Berlin so that the US, Britain, and France couldn't get supplies and food to their peoples there. Well, the US and Britain broke that blockade by smuggling in food and supplies anyway. This made Stalin pretty mad, and yep, it definitely escalated the Cold War. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union had been developing nuclear weapons of their own, which understandably freaked Truman out when he first learned about it. In the following months, Truman would help organize what became known as NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a military alliance of mostly democratic countries united against the Soviet Union. NATO also still exists today and now includes 32 different countries. For the rest of his presidency, Truman approved more and more nuclear bomb tests, and what resulted in a nuclear arms race between the two countries. And yep, it was Truman's decision to ultimately build and test the hydrogen bomb, a bomb far more destructive than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Another reason why Truman's approval rating had dropped so low was because he thought that African Americans deserved more rights, even though he came from a family of racists
Whose mother was an unrepentant, unreconstructed Southerner who would not sleep in the Lincoln bedroom even when she visited him in the White House.
and often had racist prejudices himself. Truman was kind of ahead of his time when it came to civil rights. Famously, on July 26, 1948, Truman signed an executive order getting rid of discrimination in the military, quote, on the basis of race, color, religion, or national origin. The desegregation of the U.S. Armed Forces is often seen as one of Truman's greatest achievements and a significant early event in what became known as the Civil Rights Movement. Much of Truman's domestic agenda was blocked, however. The, quote, fair deal was a series of proposals by Truman that generally expanded on FDR's New Deal programs. He called for things like more protections for workers, a higher federal minimum wage, improved housing, increased aid to the unemployed, students, entrepreneurs, and farmers, more federal funding for public works, and universal health insurance. His opponents often called his proposals, quote, socialist, of course, and many were seen as unrealistic. After Truman vetoed the Taft-Hartley Act, a law that dramatically limited the power of labor unions, Congress overrode his veto. Despite a hostile Congress and increasingly hostile American public, Truman decided that he wanted to stay president anyway, running for election in 1948. Though Truman tried to moderate his civil rights positions, some Democrats were like, nuh-uh, and walked out of the Democratic Convention, even starting a new political party called the States Rights Democratic Party. Members of this party, known as Dixiecrats, made it a priority to keep the policy of racial segregation in the South. Ugh. The presidential election of 1948 ended up being a four-way race. Heck, even FDR's vice president before Truman, Henry Wallace, was running against him. It didn't look good. Most people predicted that Truman would lose this election. In fact, just before Election Day, journalists were so confident that Truman's main opponent, Thomas Dewey, would win that they went ahead and wrote articles ahead of time proclaiming him as the next president. Well, in what is considered to be one of the greatest election upsets in American history, Truman won. No one seemed to see this one coming, and yet Truman easily got a majority of electoral votes. He sure had some fun holding up this newspaper. Classic. At the beginning of his second term, Truman's attention once again went abroad, now specifically to Asia. Well, more specifically, the Korean Peninsula. North Korea launched an invasion of South Korea to try to reunify Korea, but under communist rule, Truman went through the United Nations to aid South Korea, while China and the Soviet Union aided North Korea. In fact, Truman ordered American forces to support South Korea without first consulting Congress. Officially, it was a, quote, police action. In reality, it was another war. Just 5 years after World War II ended, now known as the Korean War, it ultimately resulted in the deaths of around 5 million people, including a larger proportional civilian death toll than World War II. General Douglas MacArthur led American forces. Big MacArthur is here to stop them, but soon grew frustrated as the war turned into a stalemate. MacArthur suggested that the United States use nuclear weapons on the advancing Chinese forces, but Truman fortunately turned that down. After MacArthur went to the media to talk trash about Truman, Truman did something actually quite courageous. He fired the popular MacArthur.
He wouldn't start a war with the Chinese, so it was seen as kind of weak. You've got the bomb, use it. I mean, people would say, why won't he just put an end to this and just do something dramatic? But Truman knew that he had to end World War II in very dramatic fashion. He wasn't about to start World War III, and he knew that's what it would be. If the Korean Peninsula ignited, it would be not only the start of World War III, but as World War II had ended with nuclear weapons, World War III would begin with nuclear weapons.
The Korean War would drag on as a stalemate for the rest of Truman's presidency. Soon China was aiding communists in Vietnam, so Truman started secretly aiding the anti-communists there. Where's my foreshadowing thunder at? There you go. Meanwhile, back home, there was the rise of the Second Red Scare, a period of hysteria and paranoia over the perceived threat of the Soviet Union and communism in general, also known as McCarthyism, as the U.S. Senator Joseph McCarthy became the most prominent public figure, recklessly accusing people within the American government of being communists. Truman tried to not get caught up in it. That said, he likely accidentally made it worse after signing an executive order that required that people be screened for, quote, loyalty before they be allowed to work for the federal government. You thought his approval rating was bad in 1948? It was even worse in 1952. Truman left office as one of the most unpopular presidents in American history. No cap. Truman considered running for president again in 1952. However, basically, everyone around told him, dude, you're not gonna win. So Truman announced he was retiring, and he and his family returned home to independence. After he left office, he had no desire to take advantage of his position as president. He had lots of cushy job offers, most of them paying well over $1 million a year, but he turned them all down, saying taking those jobs would hurt the dignity of the office of the president. But the image of Truman as being poor in his retirement years is misleading. He actually made quite a bit of money after his presidency. Eventually. First of all, Truman made money from writing memoirs. Second, he acquired this massive property. You may recall this is the old Truman farm home. Truman actually considered making this the site of his presidential library, but probably changed his mind when he realized he could make some money cashing in on it. He ultimately sold most of the 600 acres for development. If you hadn't noticed already, there is development all around us. Now this is smack dab in the middle of Grandview, Missouri. Not so serene here anymore. Instead, he chose this site. The Truman Library and Museum opened on July 6, 1957. It was the first presidential library created under the guidelines of the Presidential Libraries Act. Of all the presidential libraries, this is the one I know the best. In fact, I have taken many field trips to this place. There's, of course, a replica of the Oval Office as it looked like when Truman was president.
Yeah, look how many ashtrays are on the desk. Truman wasn't a smoker. And that leads into a private secretary's office, and on the other side of that is the cabinet. And the president comes into that. Ever since Obama, it has been that there are two pictures on either side of that, two paintings, one of George Washington and the other of Harry Truman. Those are the two presidents that preside over the cabinet room.
Around this time is when he was finally able to own his own home. Yes, this one. Bess's mother passed away, and so Bess and Harry inherited it. I learned recently that by 1959, Truman's wealth was the equivalent of more than $10.2 million in today's money, so he was actually very rich. But the thing is, he only got rich after becoming president, and he never acted like it until the Truman Library opened up. The Truman home served as Truman's office. He spent the last years of his life reading, writing, occasionally making public appearances, and taking walks. In fact, he'd go on these walks in the neighborhood despite everyone recognizing him and him likely being stopped in the street. This was before presidents got Secret Service protection after they left office, by the way. People would just hang out in their yard, often asking to take a picture with the president, and he always gladly left them. Otherwise, Harry and Bess were pretty low-key and tried to blend in the neighborhood. In 1965, President Lyndon Johnson signed Medicare into law at the Truman Library and Museum. There, he gave the first two Medicare cards to Harry and Bess. By that time, Harry's health had declined after a big fall, but he ended up living to be older than most presidents. Harry Truman died on December 5th, 1972, at a hospital I used to work at in Kansas City. He was 88 years old. Bess held a simple ceremony at the Truman Library Museum instead of a big state one in D.C. Still, more than 75,000 people showed up to pay their respects. Harry Truman has continued to exceed expectations long after he died. For decades now, he has consistently been ranked as one of the greatest presidents in American history. But remember, he was unpopular when he was president. Only after he died did many Americans begin praising him.
Truman leaves office with some of the lowest poll numbers in recorded history, of all of our presidents, even up to the present day. And what's significant about that is that today he's ranked the fifth or sixth most important president behind Washington, Lincoln, and the two Roosevelts, typically.
Even though when Truman left office, he left with that approval rating, by the time he died in 1972, there was a Truman Renaissance. And that Renaissance continues. I was very lucky to have experienced the Truman Renaissance of the 1990s. And what's wonderful is the reassessment is still happening today.
The reason Truman left office with such low poll numbers had a lot to do with the Korean War. As you fast forward another 10 or 15 years, and Johnson is bogged down in the quagmire of Vietnam. And suddenly, people realize that, maybe there is something worse than a stalemate in Asia you can actually lose. Harry Truman's restraint is seen not as weakness, but as wisdom.
The other part of it is you see a spike in the early 1970s, and that's when Richard Nixon resigns. And you look at the Watergate scandal, and then people are looking back nostalgically to say, hey, when did we have a president that had, good morals, didn't lie to the public, and Harry Truman emerges out of that.
The buck stops here.
Right.
And because of that, I think people said, wow, this guy mattered, and he was important. And I think today, we look for that kind of leadership. He was unique. He was there will never be anybody like him again.
Indeed, Harry Truman was not your typical dude to become president. Well, we'll probably never have a president named Harry again, that's for sure. He was the last president not to graduate from college. He never wanted to be president. A fact that many people forget is that most who have become president in American history grew up at least fairly wealthy or had power before entering politics. Truman did not. He struggled financially for most of his life. You know, like most Americans struggle financially for most of their lives. He was one of us, a working class dude.
One of the reasons why Truman was able to confound the experts in the 1948 election was that the whistle-stop campaign, when Truman would come into these towns on that train and get onto that rear platform and talk to these big groups of people, he could look them in the eye and say, if you're a farmer, I'm a farmer, I know what you're going through. He could look soldiers in the eye and say, I know what your life is like. He could look somebody who owned a business in the eye and say, you know what, I've had a business. I've had several businesses. They didn't do well. So he was able to relate to these people.
In fact, if it weren't for him befriending James Pendergast, you likely wouldn't have heard of him. Perhaps this explains why he was so humble compared to so many politicians. Quote, "No young man should go into politics if he wants to get rich or if he expects an adequate reward for his services," he once said. "An honest public servant can't become rich in politics. He can only attain greatness and satisfaction by service. I would much rather be an honorable public servant and known as such than to be the richest man in the world."
I think one of the reasons he was such a great president is that he never intended to be president. He didn't adjust his biography growing up so that he could appear a certain way. There's something about Truman that stands out even among decision makers, and that is that Truman didn't have to just make a lot of difficult decisions. He was decisive. He didn't look back. He didn't second guess himself. He didn't wring his hands. He didn't take polls to decide what was popular. He didn't convene focus groups to find out, what was going to be the best way to go.
Just the series of momentous decisions that he had to face. You got some of the presidents when you compare them, and there isn't an international crisis. Maybe there is, maybe there's one. He has some, it's almost every month there's a whole new crisis. And he stumbles through some of it. He's not successful in everything, but he's sort of constantly, like his house is falling down and he's having to repair things as things go on. So it's just the series of decisions he faces are really unmatched compared to any other president, in my opinion.
Well, speaking of big decisions, difficult decisions, one of the things that makes this museum so unique is the decision center.
Right.
So could you maybe explain?
Absolutely. Students get to run a simulation, and they get to role play President Truman and his team of advisors or cabinet members. We have 5 different scenarios that the teachers choose, and then they do some preparation with their students before they come. And then they come in and role play. They get to decide what they would have done if they were president at that time. But they also have to answer questions about it. So our last piece of the decision center is a press conference where the president announces their decision. But all the other students are now the media, and they ask questions of this decision. The president doesn't know what those questions are going to be.
But now I probably better admit something to you. At the beginning of this video, I lied to you. I told you that Truman was the most average person to become president. But I hope you recognize by now that history made it nearly impossible for Harry Truman to be average. And I will add, Harry Truman was arguably more connected to the average American than any other president.
We are still living in his world many, many decades after he left us. There aren't too many presidents about whom you could say that.
All right, here are 3 books that I referenced while making this video. First of all, I had The Presidency of Harry S. Truman by Donald McCoy, a book that focused in on the year 1948, which to me is the most interesting year in American history. Truman's Triumphs, the 1948 election and the making of Postwar America by Andrew Busch. And finally, of course, you knew I leaned heavily on David McCullough's Truman. I highly recommend this book. Links to purchase them are in the description of this video. Of course, there are many more sources all down in the description as well. Thank you to Dean Davison and everyone here at the Truman Library and Museum, as well as everyone at the Truman Historic Sites for helping me make this video. A special thanks to everyone who let me interview them and everyone who gave me a tour, as well as Mrs. Beat. Hey, speaking of Mrs. Beat, thank you to her for helping me film this. That drone footage that you saw was by her. She is an amazing drone pilot, okay? She puts up a lot with me, so Mrs. Beat, I'm sorry I'm cranky sometimes. And finally, thank you for watching. Oh, which president video should I cover next for this series? Let me know down below. I went out of order there. Oops.